You know, you can tell when bonus stages like this one suck when modern fighting games like Street Fighter 4 have the option of turning them off. Yeesh, I must be a glutton for punishment or something, because every game I've covered since the start of the year has been really difficult, and today's Ancient DOS game, Sango Fighter 2, is no exception. Now, I'm willing to bet a lot of you didn't even know this game existed, as for the longest time it wasn't available to English-speaking gamers, and only just recently saw a translated release by Super Fighter Team. As far as sequels go, it's actually not that bad. It basically takes the formula of the original Sango Fighter and improves upon it. The trouble is that the original Sango Fighter was essentially a Street Fighter 2 cash-in game, so improving a formula set by some other game doesn't really make you stand out all that well. Still, the game does have a couple interesting aspects that you don't typically see in fighting games, so it does stray slightly from the norm in order to stand out at least a little better. But the difficulty is just... wow. Even on easy mode, this game will destroy you if you're not already good at fighting games. It's definitely harder than its predecessor, but now at least the difficulty isn't partly rooted in control issues, though I'll go a little more in depth into this later in the episode. Basically, the game's better than the original, just harder too. Sango Fighter 2 was originally developed and released into the Taiwanese market by Panda Entertainment in 1995 as both a floppy disk release and an enhanced CD-ROM release with voice clips and animated sequences. It also saw a Korean translation and release not long after, but didn't really go anywhere further than that. Then, right around the end of 2013, Super Fighter Team released an updated English translation which fixed many of the bugs from the game and incorporated all the best aspects of both the floppy disk and CD releases together. This is obviously the version I'm playing. Yeah, the copyright from Super Fighter Team says 2010 in the game itself, but trust me, it was only just recently released. 2010 was when they started work on this re-release. The game cycles between two different VGA graphics modes, 320x200 256 colors for the fighting, action, and character selection, and 640x480 16 colors for everything else. In terms of audio, it supports a few different devices, though for sake of simplicity you should probably just stick with Sound Blaster sound support. As for its current release date, the 2013 re-release by Super Fighter Team is freeware and can be downloaded from www.sangofighter2.com. If you want the original game in a box though, well, unless you're in China or South Korea, you're probably never going to encounter a copy. The story for Sango Fighter 2 is pretty generic and basically comes down to a power struggle between three different emperors vying for control of the Eastern Han Dynasty in China. While I could go into specifics, many of those specifics are just the names of people attacking certain places, so it's not exactly a story that's riveting or detailed. Or at least, not without the massive amount of context and backstory that's supposed to go with it, but isn't present in the game, so I'm just going to leave it at that. But there are a couple interesting things to say about the story as a whole. The first is something I completely missed when I originally covered the first Sango Fighter game, and it comes up in the story text itself, right there. This game, and in fact even the original Sango Fighter, are based on the details of a story called Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which led to a massive series of strategy games across several computers and video game consoles, including systems as old as the NES and as new as the PlayStation 2. The other interesting thing about the story, and something I again should have taken more time to look up with the first game, is that it's not entirely a work of fiction. Many of the names and situations present in Romance of the Three Kingdoms is based on the actual history of the Eastern Han Dynasty from many centuries ago. Now, obviously the real-life counterparts of these characters didn't have the ability to throw energy balls or kick someone a dozen times from mid-air without touching the ground, but the point still stands that as far as cash-in fighting games are concerned, at least this one has some semblance of realism and historical context, and it isn't just making up ridiculous side stories or coming up with characters that don't make any logical sense at all, which is something even the Street Fighter series itself is guilty of now. The fighting gameplay of Sango Fighter 2 is almost identical to its predecessor, though with a number of improvements, the biggest and most obvious one being that you can actually do proper diagonal jumping with the keyboard controls now. And for that reason alone, I actually recommend playing this game with the keyboard instead of with an arcade stick or gamepad, unlike the first Sango Fighter, which controls better with those devices instead of with the keyboard. The reason for this is because of the sheer number of special moves that require you to push forwards then back, or back then forwards. In terms of similarities, many of the special moves are the same for the characters present in both games, but there's some new characters too, creating a roster of 16 playable characters in total, which is actually a fairly impressive number for a fighting game from the 90s. And that's not counting the little soldiers you can play as in the story mode either. The powered up moves also work the same way as before, where you build up your special bar by holding back, and once it's fully charged, 1 to 3 of the character's special moves and or throws will become much more powerful than usual. The story mode is the meat of the game, of course, but what makes it very interesting is that you don't just fight people in a linear fashion. You actually need to direct your forces in order to help protect the regions you have control of, and you also need to launch attacks to push into other regions. Before you start the story mode, you also need to choose your leaders, which will determine which area you control from the start and which characters you can play as when you're actually fighting. Now, I should note that even though it might seem like this system is highly strategic, it really isn't, since the forces you can direct amount to soldiers who have very little health and very little combat ability, and once you lose them, they never come back. So chances are, by the end of the game, no one's going to have any soldiers left at all. Not to mention, the computer-controlled areas will never attack each other, even if they're under control by opposing factions. Though, all that said, you should probably still play it with some sort of strategy in mind. Just don't fret over it, since so long as you're good at fighting games, it's not going to really matter in the long run. The story mode also introduces some extra aspects into the fighting system. For starters, before the characters vying to do battle make their appearances, the soldiers come out first. You can send up to 3 soldiers into battle, both when defending or attacking, depending on how many you have in the particular area. There's also 3 different kinds of soldiers, who wield 3 different kinds of weapons: swords, spears, and bows. The sword-wielding soldiers and spear-wielding soldiers are very similar in terms of capabilities, while the archers can fire both regular arrows and flaming arrows. One big tip I can give you with the archers, though, is to avoid using the flaming arrows, since they can take longer to shoot. And when you're actually up against an archer, getting close to keep them from firing their arrows. Once the generals themselves come into battle, every once in a while they'll have an opening to flee from combat should they wish to do so, which is done by moving off the back edges of the screen when indicated that it's possible. For the player, this is the back left, and for the opponent, it's the back right. Fleeing from combat can be a surprisingly smart thing to do if a battle isn't going so well, since your character can rest between turns of the strategy aspect and regain some health. This is especially important if you're commanding Liu Bo, since he's running solo and needs all the health he can get if he's going to conquer the other 3 emperors. There's also just a regular old battle mode where you simply select a character and face all 16 characters in a random order, with special bonus games coming up a total of 3 times through the course of all this. This can take up to and over an hour to do, depending on how good you are at the game, so just like with the story mode, you can save your progress through the battle mode when you attempt to quit. One last thing I should mention is that since the game actually has voice cues now for all of the characters, it's kinda embarrassing how much I messed up the pronunciation of everyone's names in the coverage of the first game. It also explains why the translations were different between the unauthorized translation of the first game compared to Super Fighter Team's translation. There's actually different ways to Romanize Chinese words, so while the names were spelled differently between the 2 different versions, they were still technically supposed to be pronounced in a particular way that wasn't exactly represented by the way they were written in either case. Heck, it's differences between the different languages which results in mistranslations like conglaturation, just to name one of the more infamous examples that's seen in numerous video games from the 80s. This game is incredibly difficult, even on its easiest difficulty setting, but there's actually a very specific reason why, and it basically comes down to something called reaction time. Speaking in terms of game design, reaction time is the time it takes for an AI-controlled character to notice something happening and react to it. In a fighting game with proper difficulty adjustments, reaction time will have a very human feel to it on lower skill settings, usually amounting to anywhere between 0.1 and 0.2 seconds, and it'll be nearly but not quite instantaneous on higher difficulty settings, usually on the order of 0.02 to 0.05 seconds. I know that seems like barely any time at all, but remember that a person skilled at fighting, either in game form or in real life, is able to not only react very quickly to the slightest motions made by an opponent, but are also able to predict what the opponent might do given a certain circumstance. However, speaking as a game programmer instead of as a designer, reaction time is a surprisingly difficult thing to code, because you essentially need to create a queue of events which the AI has noticed, and each event needs to be timed as to how long it will sit in queue before the AI reacts to it. Each event also needs to have its own margins of error, as well as timing in terms of the absolute maximum time it should sit in queue, timings in terms of when to perform a reaction to the event, as well as cancellation circumstances, which can cancel the event should some other event also happen before the first event is reacted to. And this all needs to happen really fast. So it basically amounts to writing lots of complicated code just to incorporate delays on the order of fractions of a second. So if you're not that talented a programmer or just lazy and don't want to go through all that work, you're just going to make the AI react instantly to everything that happens, since that's super easy to do. And that's essentially what's happening here in Sango Fighter 2. In fact, this was happening in the first game too, but let me explain why it's a real problem here. Firstly, let's just get this out of the way. Reaction time is essential to making an AI-controlled character feel believable. If an AI character reacts instantly to everything the player does, they not only become predictable, but unfair in the process because they're able to block, defend, or counter player actions which even a real person with tons of experience wouldn't be able to do, because they're simply reacting inhumanly fast. But the reason why this is more of a problem here than in the first game is because in the first game, the difficulty setting also affected blocking. In this game, it doesn't. Here, the AI will block absolutely every attack you make if they're not already attacking you, even if they attack you while you're blocking and you counterattack, because the AI immediately scans which attack you're about to perform and institutes the correct defense. To that end, you're going to find that throwing moves are essential to winning this game, since you can't block throws. The throw range is also fairly decent for all the characters, and many of the characters have more than one throwing move. Not to mention the AI seems to have a bit of a blind spot for dealing with situations where they may get thrown. This makes some of the characters from the first game who are only average there extremely powerful here, since their moveset is better suited versus the methodology of the AI. Overall, Sango Fighter 2 is definitely better than the first game. The graphics, while still depressing from all the scenes of war and violence, are well drawn and colored. While the music is nothing special, but not so horrible you want to shut it off immediately. The gameplay is the catch, as this game is incredibly difficult compared to the first game, and thus unless you're at least somewhat decent at fighting games, you can just forget about making any progress in this one. If you are good at fighting games though, then this is definitely one to at least take a look at. If you're interested in this game but not that good at fighting games in general, then you should probably check out the first Sango Fighter game, since it's easier. And if you have no interest in fighting games at all, then there's really nothing here for you. In terms of DOSBox settings, all you gotta do is set cycles to max and turn off timed intervals for the joystick support. In fact, even if you don't want to use a joystick or gamepad, you should turn off timed intervals anyways, since you won't be able to control the menus properly if you don't. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. I really need to take a break from all these really difficult games, so next week for episode 130, we're gonna go racing, perform some magic tricks, do some underwater diving, heck, we'll even put an android together. How's that sound? Yeah, you guys know what game this is, so send your guesses as soon as you can to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to see how all of those things could possibly be incorporated into a single game.
如虚口之意失利。